Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Pascale Bird, and I am the Executive Director of Legal Response International, otherwise known as LRI. It's my great pleasure to invite you to join us for this webinar, and I'm really pleased that you're with us today on some of the expectation for COP30. We have 1 hour, which is not a lot. So inevitably, this is going to be a very high level outline of some of the main topics that are expected to be discussed and negotiated at COP, but by no means comprehensive. There will be time for questions, we think, at the end. We hope at the end. So by all means, do put your questions in the chat, and then we'll try and address them at the end. And at that point, there will be also an opportunity for you to just raise your hand and ask questions if you have got any. So just by way of very brief introduction and context, the Brazilian, as you know, COP30 is going to take place in Belem in Brazil. And the Brazilian presidency have already clearly indicated what they see as some of the priorities for this COP. And these include an acceleration of the energy transition, protecting forests and biodiversity, enhancing climate adaptation, mobilizing finance, and ensuring a just transition for developing countries in particular. The presidency have also said that this is going to be an implementation COP. So the focus will be on implementation and action, and they have also indicated that the agenda will be structured under 6 thematic axes, and that the way that the negotiation will be held will be as what they call a global mutirão, or collective effort. So it's the idea being that it is meant to be inclusive and an effort on all countries for this. I will now hand over to my colleague, Harrison Cox, who is going to talk to you about mitigation. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascale. So I will start off by looking at what mitigation is. I will then present the nationally determined contributions, as well as very briefly their relationship to the global stocktake. And I will then present what NDCs have already been submitted in 2025, the third round of NDCs, and I will finish off by taking a look at the mitigation work programme. So mitigation is understood as efforts to reduce emissions and enhance sinks to reach the global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible, in the idea of reaching a balance between emissions and removals in the second half of the century. So efforts to reduce emissions include various avenues, including renewable energies or approaches to circular economy, and enhancing sinks includes increasing the area of forest cover or ocean mangroves, among many. All of this is due to the direct relation between the concentration of carbon dioxide and global average temperatures. So NDCs, the nationally determined contributions, are the main obligation of the parties under the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals. So under Article 4.2 of the Paris Agreement. The NDCs, nationally determined contributions, this Article 4.2 indicates that they should be maintained and updated regularly to update mitigation objectives. So these plans detail how and how much countries will cut emissions and how they will adapt to the impacts of climate change, among other elements, including loss and damage, which we're seeing more and more in NDCs. So NDCs are submitted every 5 years, starting in 2020, and new or updated NDCs every 5 years thereafter for a period of 10 years. It's a procedural obligation to prepare and communicate and maintain successive NDCs, but there's also an obligation of result, as has been highlighted by the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, as part of a due diligence standard, as these NDCs need to be adequate and represent the highest possible level of ambition. However, we see that within the UNFCCC, the compliance and accountability mechanisms are only able to examine the procedural aspects of NDCs, so maintaining and communicating successive NDCs, and not their actual level of ambition. Beyond the UNFCCC, such as at the domestic level, states could still be responsible for what they communicate in their NDCs. NDCs this year, so NDCs 3.0, the 2025 NDCs are an important set of NDCs as they are the first to follow the global stocktake, which Monserrat will talk about later. The GST1, the first global stocktake, recognized that parties weren't currently on track to meet the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And importantly for their NDCs, it reaffirmed that successive NDCs must represent a progression beyond the party's current NDC and reflect its highest possible ambition. This new set of NDCs, so the 2025 NDCs, the third generation, were to be submitted by the 10th of February 2025, setting objectives through to 2035. However, only 13 countries met this deadline, so a new deadline has now been set for the 30th of was set for the 30th of September. But because of this, because so many countries missed the deadline, the Paris Agreement Implementation and Compliance Committee, which is a non-punitive body that ensures compliance under the UNFCCC and reports to the CMA on which parties did not submit their NDCs, actually started considerations of the issues against or with 171 parties to address this question of why they didn't submit their NDCs in time. As in the previous generation of NDCs, the pike was not set up in time. We don't actually know what will come from this yet, and we're still waiting to see the pike's report on this question. But we now know that there's 62 NDCs that have now been submitted. So for the September 30th deadline, among them, we see kind of a mix of developed and developing countries, but we still only reach, the 62 NDCs still only reach around 31% of global greenhouse gas emissions, meaning that the NDC synthesis report that will be produced by the Secretariat in advance of COP30 and which will inform discussions, it is really only representing and presenting around a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. This is due to a couple of countries, a few main emitters which haven't submitted their NDCs, such as China and the EU, even though we have heard from them on what those objectives will be. So we have here a map of all of the NDCs that have been submitted today. There was a report that was published by the World Resources Institute in June, which analyzed the 22 first NDCs, which highlighted that these NDCs are still insufficient to reach the 1.5 degrees goal and likely insufficient for the 2 degrees goal. And so finally, to finish off on the mitigation work program, I'm going to skip over most of its history, but essentially the mitigation work program was set up in 2021 in Glasgow to urgently enhance mitigation ambition and implementation. It was designed at the time as a complement to the GST. Tensions have really been quite evident in the negotiations since it was created, and not much progress has been made. At COP29 in Baku, there was, again, tensions on how the mitigation work program would incorporate the global stocktake. But they did still reach, finally, a consensus on creating a digital platform to connect initiatives and projects with investors. However, we have now seen since COP29 at SB62, that this digital platform has created more tension. Discussions on this digital platform have created more tension as many countries see it as unnecessary because there are already institutions that do this role. And so at COP30, they're going to discuss essentially this digital platform and based on the procedural outcomes from SB62. I will now pass over to Pascale.
Thank you very much, Harrison. I am now going to talk about adaptation. Now, why do we talk about adaptation? Why is this important in the negotiation? Well, I think it's quite clear that the science is telling us Media reports are telling us, and actually our own eyes are telling us, that the climate impacts around the world are accelerating and intensifying. And usually, of course, unfortunately, hitting the world's most vulnerable hardest. So countries have started responding. They are putting in place adaptation plans and strategies, etc. But we know that the efforts that are being put are lagging behind the needs. For many countries, there's a very large gap between the needs, and when I talk about the need, I talk in terms of financial flows, but also in terms of capacity building and about technology transfer to improve the effectiveness of adaptation action. And this gap is between those needs and what's done is really very important. So this is what the negotiations have been about really in recent years. But just going back a moment to first of all, to the UNFCCC process and the beginning of it. So the convention, the UN Framework Convention, does cover adaptation and amongst its objective and operative provisions. But it is, the convention was very much mitigation centric. And as a result of that, for many years, there were calls, in particular from developing countries, to try and redress that imbalance and give more have a parity between adaptation and mitigation. And these calls really were, I suppose, heard and accepted through the Paris Agreement, which has got a dedicated article on adaptation. And this is what you see on your screen. This is Article 7 of the Paris Agreement, and Article 7, paragraph 1, establishes a global goal on adaptation of enhancing adaptive capacities, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. So this was all great, but this goal of itself is quite vague, and it doesn't really, the Article 7 itself did not really very much elaborate on this goal. It didn't expand on its qualities. It did not quantify it in any way. So if it was going to remain more than just an aspirational goal, it was quite clear that it should be fleshed out. And this is really what the negotiation and the decision that have been taken in recent years are about. Next slide, please. So the operationalization of the GGA started really in 2021 at COP26, and was aimed with the launch of a program that was aimed at developing a framework to track and measure progress on adaptation. This led then to the adoption of the UAE framework for global climate resilience, and this framework established 7 thematic targets in key areas such as around food, health, ecosystem, water, etc., as well as some dimensional target around the iterative adaptation cycle. It also launched 2-year work program to develop indicators to track progress on those targets, which was set to conclude in Belem, hence the name UAE Belem Work Program. So why do we need measurable targets, and why do we need indicators? This is, and I've alluded to this already, because adaptation progress is not easy to quantify. By contrast to mitigation, it is easier to quantify and to be able to track CO2 emissions, etc., than it is the different dimension of adaptation. Hence, the work that is being done here. Next slide, please. Sorry, if you go back once again to the previous one. So in Baku at COP29, a decision was adopted that reaffirmed and explicitly requested experts to map existing indicators and also develop new one. And also ask them to provide further guidance to develop common methodologies so that the tracking could be comparable across globally. And also added criteria to ensure that there would be transparent monitoring of this process. It was also made clear that this process should not impose additional burden on developing countries, and also that this outcome should include less than a manageable set of indicators. So next slide, please. So that's what really the work has been focusing on in Bonn at SB62, to further report on the work that had been done intersessionally by experts to further reduce this list. We now have a list of 4,900 indicators and 490, indicators, and it is expected, as I said, in Belem to have this list further reduced to no more than 100, as well as having clear guidance on indicators that are particularly relevant to adaptation, and in particular for these indicators to include what's called means of implementation, i.e. finance, technology, and capacity building, to measure things such as access, the quality and adaptation finance, etc. Next slide, please. So we expect in Belem a decision on these indicators. Other elements to operationalize the global good on adaptation include the progress on this adaptation roadmap that was established in Baku, as well as a first dialogue, again, that was established in Baku to progress again on an enhanced implementation and action on adaptation. Thank you. Next slide. So there are other adaptation topics. I'm not going to raise them here. We also, you can see here on the slide, there will be on the agenda consideration and review of the adaptation committee, progress on the formulating and implementing national adaptation plan, and also importantly, hopefully an agreement on a new adaptation finance goal to succeed the one that was adopted in Glasgow. Next slide, please. So a very, very brief roundup of loss and damage. Loss and damage is generally understood as climate-related impact that go beyond adaptation, where we can't and include both economic and non-economic losses. Under the UNFCCC, this topic has been addressed in 3 ways. First of all, through the Warsaw International Mechanism that was established by the COP in 2017, with an executive committee to supervise and coordinate the work on it. It has been really until recently the main driver of loss and damage in the regime, and its function include enhancing knowledge, action, and support. Until quite recently, the focus had been on enhancing knowledge at the expense of action and support. Hence, the additional calls and to add some other dimension, and these have been answered through the establishment of the Santiago network that more particularly focuses on catalyzing technical assistance, and more recently again in 2023 through the establishment of a loss and damage response fund. So in terms of what we expect for COP30, the challenges really that we have now, so we have these 3 institutional arrangement around loss and damage. To some extent, they have some overlapping mandate. So one challenge and one thing that is really important is to clarify those mandate and make sure that the work that is being done is well coordinated. So this will be one of the expectation to have some sort of action plan to make sure that the WIM and Santiago Network and the Loss and Damage Fund and their respective bodies, institutions are well coordinated. Another important element is to fully operationalize the fund. Developing countries in particular have been disappointed to see that so far the replenishment of the fund has been very limited. And the disbursement are actually starting in 2020, but pledges for the fund have been very limited. So having, first of all, defining the guidance and access modalities and making sure that those access modalities are direct and simplified, in particular for vulnerable countries that need it most, is very key. And I think that I will stop at this and pass over to Maha, my colleague Maha, who is going to talk about finance. Thank you.
Hi, sorry about the issue with the mic. All right, so I will be updating you on climate finance. So I will discuss first briefly what is climate finance. We all have the same basis, same understanding. Then I will explain quickly what happened a year ago, what happened at the SP62 in Bonn in June, and then look at what can we expect on the agenda for COP30. Sorry. So climate finance is an important objective of the Paris Agreement. And it's important to look at that it encompasses both private and public financial flows. So all of these flows have to become compliant with a future that is climate resilient and green. So a phasing out of course, also of fossil fuel subsidies and technologies. And it's importantly also considered a means of implementation. So it's important to share these financial resources with developing countries so that they can also follow the objectives of the Paris Agreement. And importantly, of course, is that the Paris Agreement itself, the obligations that we find in the Paris Agreement are found or are drawn from the UNFCCC. And so this is the original convention, right? And it clearly sets out the obligations that Annex 1 countries or developed states have towards the developing countries. So what happened last year, a year ago almost, in Baku? So the new quantified goal NCQG, has been adopted in the decision last year, and it sets a floor for $100 billion annually that has to go to developing countries so that they can be compliant with the Paris Agreement. It also provides that at least $300 billion per year also have to be given to developing countries for this climate action. And finally, importantly, it calls on all actors, so public, private, all different banks as well, etc., to really work together. So this spirit of cooperation to find sort of public and private sources of funding to at least 1.3 trillion per year by 2035. So that is a big goal. And importantly as well, that there was some criticism on how this decision was adopted last year. That there was it happened very fast. There was not a lot of time for consideration. In addition, it does not really clearly articulate or emphasize really the obligations that developed countries have towards giving or like providing funding to developing countries. And also, so there's still no explicit definition of climate finance. And it doesn't really take into consideration issues like human rights, but also exclusion of, certain financial flows like fossil fuel investments, etc. So moving forward, finance was also a big topic at the meetings of the subsidiary bodies in June. And so firstly, sorry, moving on. Yes. So the adoption of the agenda showed already the tensions between that were underlying since, you know, the COP 29. So with the agenda being blocked for 2 days because Bolivia wanted to add on the agenda 2 items. So one on the implementation of Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement. So the obligation of financing from developed countries, and obviously that was not really accepted or opposed by developed countries. And the second agenda that was going to be added was on the promotion of international cooperation and addressing the concerns with climate change related trade restrictive unilateral measures. But so these both were not created tensions as well. Obviously, there was still that divide between developing countries that wanted these additions opposed by developed countries that rejected them. Finally, there was some sort of agreement that there would be substantive consultations on the Article 8.1 implementation, and that would be taken, stock would be taken on these consultations and reported back at SB 63, which will happen also during the COP. And the climate change related trade restrictions, unilateral measures was also addressed under other agenda items, including the just transition. Because of lack of time, I'll move on, but so that shows already, right, the tensions that start at the agenda and that might continue sort of at the next meetings. Then about the adaptation fund, the transition between, so the adaptation fund was under the Kyoto Protocol, now moving under the Paris Agreement. So there was discussions on the arrangements. There was more or less agreement that, you know, it would be a smooth transition, a simple transition, that the wording would change so that it would reflect the Paris Agreement wording, not really using Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries anymore. There were still differences regarding sort of the terms of reference of the review, and only, you know, procedural conclusions were reached so that at the SB 63 in November, it will be considered further. Then there was also a mandated event that, yes, it's about sort of the scope of Article 2.1, subparagraph C, and its complementarity with Article 9 that occurred, and it was mostly an exchange of views of, you know, states, stakeholders on these discussions. Then, more importantly, and of course, it comes last, and I have less time, but so the Baku to Belem roadmap on 1.3 trillion was discussed because so that was part of the NCQG decision last year at the COP, and I just put there the paragraph, so paragraph 7 that states the goal, and paragraph 27 that states how we're supposed to elaborate on that goal, explain how that's supposed to happen, so that roadmap, right, like, so guide states and stakeholders, so all parties and non-parties on how are we supposed to reach that goal of 1.3 trillions, right? And so the presidencies held consultations with parties and stakeholders. The presidency from Baku emphasized, you know, that shareholders needed to foster, of course, also engagement from multilateral development banks in mobilizing that money. Similarly, the presidency from Belem also highlighted the role of, you know, COP 30 Circle of Finance Ministers in supporting that goal. Then obviously, of course, some parties that were excluded from these discussions of the Circle of Finance Ministers were not happy with this. So there are still these tensions ongoing. And also procedurally, there's a question on what will happen with that roadmap, because so for now it's been asked to be, so that roadmap will be presented at the COP in Belem, but then there's no explicit mandate for it to be either adopted or considered in negotiations. And so there is still a lack of clarity of like what will happen with that roadmap and moving forward. So will it be adopted or not? So these are questions that are still up in the air and that will have to be clarified in Belem. Thank you. I will now give the floor to Monserrat. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Let me take control of this. I'm going to be talking about just transition first and then the global stocktake. So just transition is an important topic that has gained traction in the negotiations in recent years. Pascale was also saying that it's a priority for this presidency, and I'm aiming to explain to you why this is the case. So when we talk about just transition in the context of the climate negotiations, we are referring to an idea that there should be certain fairness on the transition to a low emission economy. So as we move and we achieve the objectives of the convention and the Paris Agreement, and we move to a low emission economy, of course, there's going to be costs for certain populations, for the workforce, etc. And so we should bear those in mind, and we should ensure that this transition doesn't just happen at all costs, but is somewhat fair. The transition to a low emission economy, of course, presents certain issues of equity, which means who is going to bear these costs according to their responsibility in the climate problem, and also the underlying discussion about the carbon budget, which means that we are supposed to be allowed a certain amount of tons of emissions to keep track of the temperature goal of the Convention and the Paris Agreement. And how are we going to split these remaining emissions? That's what we're referring to by a carbon budget. And so in the negotiations, when we talk about just transition, there are competing definitions. Developed countries, and this depends, of course, on where you stand and what are your national interests. So generally speaking, developed and industrialized countries focus on the just transition as the impact that it will have on the workforce exclusively. Why? Because, of course, there's a change in their industry, in the generation of energy, and the most affected people are going to be workers. However, developing countries, which often are home to the developments for green energy, or are the places where the minerals are being sourced from, their understanding of just transition also includes not only the workforce, but also local communities, ecosystems, and vulnerable population like indigenous populations, for example. And this is important for the negotiations because it shapes where we are now and the progress that we are achieving. And so, as I was saying, just transition has been gaining track in the negotiations. It started before the Paris Agreement, with the adoption of the work program for response measures, which is a different work program, but that considered just transition as a priority area. Then in 2015, under the Paris Agreement, the just transition was mentioned in the preamble of the Paris Agreement. So we don't have a provision on just transition in the Paris Agreement. We have it in the preamble. And it was followed by multiple political declarations until 2022, when the CMA, which is the Conference of Members of the Paris Agreement that meets during the COP, established the work program on just transition, which was further defined, and the elements of it were agreed in the following COP, COP 27 or CMA 5. COP28 or CMI 5 in Dubai, and the elements were defined there, and that's why it's called now the UAE Just Transition Work Program, because it was the UAE COP. The elements are broad, so they cover workforce, but also human rights elements, communities, ecosystems, and others. So far, more inclusive than just the workforce. During 2024, there was no progress in the negotiations to further operationalize the World Transition World Program, not in the SBs and neither during COP29. And basically they were stalled because countries still were keen to ensure that their definition of just transition was going to be captured before agreeing on how the work program was going to operate. Finally, the SB 62 was able to agree at least an informal note, a draft decision to be forward to the COP30, but still has some elements to be defined. It hasn't been completely agreed. So it has some brackets, it has some pending sections and placeholders in the draft decision that you're able to look at. The main issues are still how to reflect equity, but at the same time to keep some element of ambition. So there's a tension between access to energy and energy security as a priority for the Just Transition Work Program, and including a reference to transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is something that, for example, ILAC and the LDC group are keen to include to keep an element of ambition and not just access to energy. There's, of course, the issue that Mara was referring to, the means of implementation, and also the international cooperation element in the Just Transition Work Program, as developing countries understand that there needs to be both for the Just Transition to be fair. Some countries, developing countries in particular, are keen for the Just Transition to be nationally determined, so there is not too prescriptive from the negotiations. There's some pushback on human rights language in the negotiations, unfortunately. The unilateral trade measures were discussed during the SBs in this negotiation stream. So, for example, CBAM, the European border tax that is aiming to capture the carbon emissions of products that are being imported. For some countries, for developing countries, this is unfair. This is considered a unilateral trade measure, and they're hoping that it could be discussed and as part of the Just Transition discussion. And then finally, the future of the work program, because it's not clear what's going to happen after the work program. Is it going to continue, but it's going to be revised? Are we going to have a permanent body on Just Transition? Are we going to have an institutional arrangement like the Santiago network, a support network? That's all not clear and to be discussed at CMA 7. So moving on now to the global stocktake. The global stocktake, as Harrison was saying in the mitigation section, is part of the ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. So every 5 years, parties should perform a collective assessment of how the implementation of the Paris Agreement is going in a collective way, not in an individual way. So the first GST was during COP28 in Dubai, 2023. And the result of this global stocktake is basically the GST decision. And the GST decision is very long. It has over 190 paragraphs that cover different aspects of the implementation of the agreement, namely mitigation, adaptation, means of implementation or the support, international cooperation, and loss and damage. After the GST1, we are waiting, for the next GST that should take place in 2028, and so there are negotiations that are still responding to the GST1, the first GST exercise, and these negotiations are in 3 different tracks. So the first one is a discussion about refining the procedural and logistical elements of the global stocktake, just looking how it went, what could be done better, and it should have been finalized, this review, at CMA 6, which means COP29 last year, but it wasn't. The main issue still is that while parties want to have more time for the political discussion, which means finishing the input phase earlier, some parties want to make sure that certain crucial inputs are still considered. And by this, I mean the IPCC report, the next one, which is going to be ready after the input phase of the next GST, the next GST cycle starts. And so a way to work this out is to name the IPCC report as a critical input, but some parties disagree with that, and hopefully during these negotiations, in light of the advisory opinions and the recognition of the IPCC reports as the best available science, maybe that could influence this discussion a bit, and that could be solved. The second negotiation stream for the GST is an annual dialogue that Harrison referred to, where countries discuss and share views on how the previous GST is shaping their NDCs. So there have been 2 dialogues on 2024 and 2025, and the last COP did not consider the 2024 dialogue. So both dialogues, which are summarized in a report, are going to be considered by this CMA. Informally, there's been talk about perhaps not repeating this dialogue, as parties think that since the NDCs are being submitted now, there's no purpose on having another dialogue the following year. And then finally, the most contested issue, I think, in the GST negotiations is the UAE dialogue on implementing the GST outcomes. So this is a different dialogue that aims to follow how the GST decision is being implemented, not by parties in their NDCs, but by the process in general. And so from the beginning, there's been discussion about the scope of this dialogue. Is it only about finance because it is placed under the finance section of the GST decision, or should it cover all the outcomes, including very important ones like the transition away from fossil fuels and others, finance, etc.? Excuse me. These negotiations are stalled for this reason, and so they should have been agreed on the modalities for the dialogue on the last COP as well, CMA 6, but this was not possible. They're still being worked out, and of course this is a problem because these negotiations would be the dialogue if it was already defined and taking place. It would be an important space to follow on the outcomes of the GST, which at the moment do not have a home in the negotiations. So we can't speak of how the GST is being implemented, the GST decision. I'll leave it up there and hand it over to Harrison.
Thank you, Monse. So I will now start talking about technology development and transfer within the UNFCCC. So I'll first explain what technology transfer and development is, and then I'll have a quick overview of the legal architecture and the technology mechanism before exploring what is going to be discussed at COP30 and what has been discussed in recent years. So technology transfer and development refers broadly to products used to mitigate or adapt to climate change, such as renewable energy sources, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, or early warning systems. So technology transfer and development is developed under Article 4.7 of UNFCCC, as well as Article 10 of the Paris Agreement. It's really a recognition of the importance of technology to enhance climate resilience, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it establishes obligations for parties to cooperate, and importantly, an obligation on developed country parties to support developing country parties. This was reinforced by the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion on climate change, in which it really highlighted that technology transfer is one of the principal forms of cooperation under the Paris Agreement, alongside the provision of climate finance. So this Article 10 of the Paris Agreement is really a recognition of this importance of transferring technologies from developed countries to developing countries. This transfer involves not only the act of developed countries offering new technologies to developing countries, but also capacity building work to successfully install, operate, and maintain those technologies. The technology mechanism was established in 2010 at COP16. It has two kind of branches: the Technology Executive Committee, which is the technology mechanism's policy arm, which analyzes and provides recommendations on key issues surrounding technology transfer, and then the CTCN, the Climate Technology Center and Network, which is the implementation arm, hosted by the UN Environment Programme. It supports countries in implementing technologies by coordinating a network of stakeholders. In 2015, with the Paris Agreement's adoption, this was clarified and built upon. So the Paris Agreement, first of all, indicates that the technology mechanism also serves the Paris Agreement in Article 10.3, and then in Article 10.4, the Paris Agreement establishes a technology framework, which we can see at the top on the slide. The technology framework is essentially a guide to the technology mechanism under a set of guiding principles. The technology mechanism, as well as the technology framework, are both implemented by the Technology Executive Committee and the Climate Technology Centre and Network. In 2015, parties, so at the time of the Paris Agreement's adoption, parties also agreed to assess the effectiveness and adequacy of support provided periodically relating to technology. This assessment of support, technology support, was integrated into the first GST, Global Stocktake, which Monserrat just talked about, which highlighted profound concerns surrounding insufficient funding to complete mandates, as well as unequal access to technology. This then led to what we now have, the kind of final form of the technology mechanism from 2022/2023, which, so the GST's outcomes led to the creation of the Technology Implementation Programme, which we can see down here in yellow on the right. This TIP, as it's called, is designed to strengthen support for the implementation of technology priorities and to address challenges identified in that periodic assessment. It also, at a similar, during those years, the joint work program was also created between the CTCN and the TEC to incorporate guidance from a technology framework and to align the work of both institutions. Now that we've seen the technology mechanism, we can have a quick overview of what's going to be discussed at COP30 on technology. So technology transfer and development will be addressed under 4 agenda items. These 4 agenda items include, so first of all, the joint annual report of the TEC and the CTCN. These institutions prepare an annual report on their activities, both joint activities and individual activities, and report on how well those activities went and any needs they need to be addressed for future years. This report generally highlights the lack of funding that the TEC and CTCN have and the difficulties linked to that. The parties will then address technology under the review of the Climate Technology Centre and Network, which was decided at COP29 that there would be this review of the functions and also deciding whether to extend the term of the Climate Technology Centre and Network. This review was initiated in Bonn in June earlier this year at SP62 and assessed the effectiveness, scope, and operational relevance of the Climate Technology Centre and Network. Parties at that time generally welcomed its role, especially in technical assistance, capacity building, and project design, but they did highlight the need for it to be more responsive to local context, to local needs and context-specific needs. At COP30, they will most
Sorry, there's a small technical issue. Harrison will be back shortly.
I'm back. Yeah. Okay. Apologies for that. My computer crashed. So I was saying the Climate Technology Centre Network will be reviewed at COP30, most likely be reconducted further along the line as parties are generally quite happy. The third topic that will be discussed is the linkages between the technology mechanism and the financial mechanism. Under this, so the financial mechanism is composed of the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, the GEF, Global Environment Fund, the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and the Adaptation Fund. This is the recognition. Can you still see the presentation? Thank you. This follows a recognition that there really needs to be a linkage and improvement of the linkages between these two bodies, because this is what will really help parties to further cooperate and further implement the goals of the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. And finally, on the Technology Implementation Programme, which was recently established, parties so far have been unable to reach an agreement, and so they have kind of floated the idea of a technology acceleration and transfer hub to streamline deployment and development of technologies in developing countries. But this has been quite fiercely opposed, most notably by developed countries who question the need for another institution beyond the Climate Technology Center and the tech. So SB 62 couldn't conclude considerations of this matter, so it's going to be on the agenda again at COP30, where we're kind of waiting to see if parties can reach an agreement or not. I will now pass over to Mara.
Hi, okay, I'm back. Now I will discuss briefly about Article 6, so the three elements, what happened and what can be expected. So at SB 62, Article 6.8 was discussed, so the non-market approaches. The 7th Glasgow Committee on the non-market approaches was held, and it really focused on the non-market approach platform. So what are the barriers, solution, etc., because that platform is supposed to showcase all the different sort of NMAs that are happening around the world and how they can be improved. So they discussed, how to enhance that platform. Also, so looking at the implementation modalities regarding financing of NMAs and technology transfer, capacity building. So there was consensus that there needs to be further coordination between the existing instruments and institutions, but still there was no agreed text on what decisions should be made about the platform yet. Then how do I do? Yes, do I have control? Sorry. That was okay. Now about Article 6.2 concerning the cooperative approaches at the SB 62, the parties discussed. They held a dialogue called the Ambition Dialogue that was sort of established at CMA 6, so last year at the COP CMA meeting, where it was intended to have this dialogue to sort of exchange about experiences on how to sort of support ambition with Article 6.2 or through Article 6.2. So at the Bonn meetings, they discussed this, exchange views with also stakeholders, and that will be continued. Or like there is going to be a second edition of that dialogue at the next meeting of the subsidiary bodies. So alongside the COP30. And finally, on Article 6.4, so the subsidiary body has been meeting quite regularly, and it considered also recently the Article 6.4 methodological expert panel's recommendations. So it did adopt different standards within which the standard for estimating the baseline. So that considers at what point the emissions that would have happened without a project under the mechanism. So it's important to determine to have a same baseline rate for all the projects. Similarly, a standard on leakage. So that's leakage are the sort of the unintended increase in emissions that can occur during a project or as a result of the project. So that's also important, right, to be before we can operationalize that mechanism. That's all, the standards are all adopted. And these, what the subsidiary body has adopted, or it will then report these standards to the CMA 7, so in November this year. And importantly as well, there is a deadline at the end of the year that parties hosting afforestation and reforestation activities as part of the clean development mechanism must apply to transition these activities under the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. So that deadline is at the end of the year, and I think that's important also maybe in the discussions at the COP30. So thank you very much for staying with us until now, until the end. We hope it was clear. We hope it gave you an overview on the many different conversations that are happening, or debates, the deliberations that will happen also at the COP. Please let us know if you have any questions. Thanks, Domenico, for your comment. Do we have any points of clarity from you? You can always email us, of course, if you need more material, more readings. We'd be happy to provide.
There was a question in the Q&A about unilateral trade measures and CBAM, which Mara and I responded there in the chat box and shared a research paper on the issue that we produced at LRI. But Liz, if you have further questions, please let us know if it's not clear.
Just on my, yeah, can I speak? Doesn't look as if we have a question. I'm sorry. I think it's been quite a lot to take in an hour. So as I said, do feel free to post some question in the chat that you have, or of course email us as well after the session if something was not clear, and we'll do our best to respond. I also just wanted to remind you, in case you don't know, that we have prepared a summary of the main outcomes from the session in June, the subsidiary bodies meeting at in the last session, as well as COP29, and this is available from our website. So feel free to look at that if you wanted a more complete reminder on some of those issues that we have discussed today. Yes, we will circulate the slide. The event is being recorded, and so we will do so. And finally, for those of you who are going to be in Belem, we are going to be there, the 4 of us, for the whole period, the 2 weeks. So feel free to reach out if you have any question or want to just discuss an issue. We will be there to support you as better as we can, and with our network, of course, of experts on hand as well, and on standby to assist remotely. So I think this leaves us to just say thank you very much again for attending today. And yes, look forward to meeting some of you in Belem in the next few weeks. And otherwise, thanks as well for you, those of you who are on the expert or on the support, volunteering with us. And I hope this has been useful for you as well. Thank you. Goodbye.